We've all heard the tragic history of white slave owners abusing enslaved black women. But there's another story, one less often discussed but equally disturbing, the story of the plantation mistresses.
These women,
Dressed in fine silk and lace, could be as cruel as their husbands. Sometimes, they even forced themselves on enslaved black men. Life for these mistresses was a strange mixture of privilege and bitterness. On the plantation, they ranked just below their husbands, issuing commands, doling out punishment, and sometimes taking a perverse satisfaction in humiliating those beneath them. A dropped plate, a perceived look of defiance, these could lead to a slave being flogged, or made to stand in the blistering southern sun for hours, their skin burning, legs trembling, lips cracked with thirst. Yet mercy never came. The plantation system was built to crush the human spirit, and no one understood this better than those who enforced its rules. Former slave Harriet Jacobs, in her memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, paints a world steeped in sexual danger, where enslaved girls were hunted by white men and treated with jealous suspicion by white women. These mistresses were captives in their own right, often married off at 15 or 16, expected to be beautiful, obedient, and constantly smiling. But their gilded lives came with keys to someone else's prison. They held power over the enslaved, and many used it ruthlessly. Their husbands' frequent affairs with enslaved women often resulted in children, who, by law, were born enslaved children who might one day fall under the mistress's command, serving as a daily reminder of betrayal and humiliation, and the humiliation often turned into cruelty. When the masters were away, sometimes for weeks or months, loneliness, bitterness, and rage would transform into something far darker. Some mistresses sought revenge not against their unfaithful husbands, but against the enslaved men and boys who had no power to refuse them. Though these encounters were rarer than the predatory acts of white masters, they did occur. And when they did, they weren't about love or desire, but about domination. In her testimony, Harriet Jacobs hints at these abuses mistresses who knew their place in the hierarchy and used their power over the enslaved to satisfy their desires. These women held the same absolute control over the enslaved as their fathers had once held over them, and this made it terrifyingly easy to target the most vulnerable. Outwardly, these mistresses were the picture of Christian virtue, the dutiful wives who managed the household. They were seen as guardians of morality in the public eye, but in the shadows, some shattered every value they claimed to protect. Behind closed doors, these women could be every bit as brutal as their husbands. Adultery in the 1800s was a dangerous gamble for any woman. Public disgrace, legal punishment, and exile awaited those who were caught. But inside the homes of southern plantations, the truth was much darker. White women, celebrated as paragons of virtue, were often anything but. In secret, some engaged in sexual encounters with enslaved black men, not out of love or desire, but to assert their power and express their frustration. When these affairs resulted in pregnancies, they created dangerous, scandalous secrets that had to be hidden. The biracial children born of these liaisons were living reminders of betrayal, and for some mistresses, they became weapons and means of asserting control that their marriages couldn't give them. This gave them a false sense of power. It was a dangerous game, balancing on the edge of public disgrace, and it revealed the ugliness of plantation life. Plantation wives were expected to be pure, devoted, and loyal. In reality, many were seething with resentment, trapped in lives just as confined as those of the enslaved. They too were in a sense property bound to men who could exploit them sexually, just as they did with enslaved women. Their lives were restricted, and their authority was limited by the laws of the South. Yet they clung to the racist system that provided them with power. Mistresses were deeply intertwined with the plantation economy. Many women, especially widows, inherited slaves and rose to enormous economic power. They didn't just inherit slaves, they bought, sold, rented, and even willed them away in death. This rare currency, ownership of humans, gave them power in a world built to suppress them. But they were also shackled by a patriarchal system that kept them dependent. To maintain their place, they held tightly to the same structure of racism. That gave them influence. They became shrewd dealers, calculating the market value of slaves and profiting from the trade. Mrs. Annie Poor, for example, didn't just inherit slaves, she trained them, watched the market, and sold them at the right time, ensuring maximum profit. These women were not mere ornaments in a man's world. They were active profiteers, carving out their place in a society designed to deny them power, all by exploiting the enslaved. On plantations, the power of the mistresses came at a heavy cost. While some may have been sympathetic to the suffering of enslaved women, others were simply cruel. Mistress Mary Boyan Chestnut, for example, criticized the sexual chaos slavery caused, but also denounced enslaved women as prostitutes, showing no sympathy for their suffering. On smaller plantations, mistresses were forced to confront their husbands' infidelities, and the humiliation often turned to violence. In her autobiography, Solomon Northup describes how one mistress had a young enslaved woman whipped out of jealousy and spite. This was no outburst of anger, it was a calculated form of terror, a daily psychological torture. Mistresses found ways to profit from enslaved women's motherhood, turning enslaved women into tools for their own comfort. They took control of the births, chose the midwives, and ensured that the children were healthy assets to be sold. In one case, Harriet Jacobs recalled how her mother was forced to stop nursing her at just 3 months old, so that the mistress's child could have the milk instead. This decision was a simple one for the mistress, but for the enslaved mother, it meant giving up the opportunity to feed her own child so another woman's could thrive. Mistresses also manipulated the lives of enslaved men. Though rare, some white women took sexual advantage of enslaved men, using their power to dominate and control. They knew the power they held and exploited it for their own desires. Even everyday life on the plantation carried a quiet, unsettling undercurrent. Enslaved men worked shirtless, their bodies often on display to the elite women of the plantation. Sometimes this curiosity would turn into exploitation, with mistresses demanding personal services or using threats to keep their desires hidden. Enslaved men were warned that if they spoke out, they would be accused of rape and destroyed. On the plantation, intimacy was never free. It was a weapon, and in the hands of a mistress, it was just as cruel as any whip. These women learned to use the same racist stereotypes that justified the abuse of the enslaved to their own advantage. History remembers the mistresses as victims of their husbands' brutality, but some were also predators in their own right. They used their power to exploit the most vulnerable bodies in their world, proving that the plantation system was not just one of labor, but one of intimate, exploitative control. These buried stories expose the ugly truths that history, too, often tries to ignore.